A disused quarry mine site sat flooded with water near the town of Eccleston since the end of World War II, and in the years since, it became a popular spot for scuba divers to explore its murky depths, which is how two amateur divers made their grim discovery in October of 1979. 30 feet beneath, they came across a body. Reporting it to police, they found the body had been mutilated, shot, and was handless. The only identifiable effect on the body was a bluestone medallion necklace embossed with a Chinese symbol. Nearly 3 weeks later, after circulating photos were released to the press, a former beauty queen and her friend revealed to Leyland police that the deceased was in fact her missing boyfriend, the head of a sophisticated drug trafficking network from New Zealand, Marty Johnston. Unknowingly, the police from Lancashire had begun to unravel the international multi-million-dollar drug ring known as the Mr. Asia Syndicate. Welcome back to another episode of Shadow Matter. Today we have an exclusive special on New Zealand's criminal underworld, detailing the life and crimes around the international drug trafficking network called by many media sources as the Mr. Asia Syndicate, or just simply Mr. Asia. The level of sophisticated logistics and organization involved with the operation had never been seen in the small country of New Zealand, and its police force believe it was the first of its kind in the nation's history. It changed the way police in New Zealand operated, gave the law more teeth in its war on drugs, and even brought about changes to international customs procedures at border security. An operation that stretched across the globe from Singapore, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually found its way to the UK, investigated by several countries' police forces, and netted the syndicate tens of millions of dollars at the height of its operations. So who were the people behind its illicit empire? A clothes salesman turned drug kingpin, a sadistic serial killer, a Singapore ship steward, corrupt police, a banker, a lawyer, and a traitor. So journey with me as we dive into the shadows of the Mr. Asia Syndicate. New Zealand is also known as Aotearoa by its native inhabitants, the Maori people, which is thought to roughly translate to mean land of the long white cloud. Although, in my research I found that the name could also mean a long time, which is apt considering New Zealand's geographic isolation from the rest of the world, making any journey take there a really long time. Situated at the bottom of the world in the South Pacific, some 4,000 kilometers away from its closest neighbor Australia, 10,000 kilometers away from the Golden Triangle, 11,000 kilometers away from South America, and 13,000 kilometers from Afghanistan, boasting a relatively small population for much of its history, the drug empires of the world never really thought New Zealand would be a viable market. In 1975, New Zealand's population was only a mere 3 million people, and the consumers of illegal drugs were fairly small, the flavor of the month being locally grown cannabis. In the early days of New Zealand's colonization by Britain, Indian hemp and cannabis sativa was not heavily introduced as an industry, as the native harakeke plant could instead be used for fiber. It wasn't until the early 1950s that marijuana was brought in by merchant ships, but mostly it grew in people's backyards unrecognized. Smoking it was seen as more of a thing for the jazz and literary cliques. In the early 1960s, New Zealand began to take notice of the drug as a result of two public crimes that made headlines and scandalized communities, also attributing the crimes to cannabis usage. The very first drug squads in New Zealand police were formed in 1964, but if their goal was to cut off the drug problem before it grew, they ultimately failed. By 1970, the number of people aged under 25 charged with drug offences jumped from 14 in the years previous to over 200. The nation now had a generation of people with an appetite to get high, the baby boomers. And for one Christopher Martin Johnston, this counterculture generation would be his first customers. Christopher Martin Johnston, who went by Marty Johnston, was born in Auckland in 1951 and attended Takapuna Grammar Secondary School in his teens. Little can be found about his childhood, and we don't know much for sure until the early 1970s when he was working in an Auckland menswear store with his friend Andrew Ma. The pair originally began their illicit career by importing marijuana from Southeast Asia in the form of what would be known as Thai Buddha sticks, with the help of a Singaporean ship steward known as Chinese Jack Chu. Chu would simply toss the bagged sticks overboard as his ships passed through the Rangitoto Channel. Marty and Andy, in a waiting boat, would then retrieve them. The imported cannabis was stronger than the locally grown New Zealand version, and naturally, the hippies, the baby boomers, and whoever else was keen to get high began to buy up large on Johnston's Asian stock. This clandestine operation ran for a few years, and everyone seemed to enjoy the fruits of their labor. But soon, there were others who wanted to cash in on this lucrative business. One of these people was a small-time career criminal, Terry Clark. Marty Johnston met Terry Clark sometime in the mid-1970s and began working alongside each other to help import illegal drugs into New Zealand via their Singapore connection, Chinese Jack. It was around this time the pair decided it was time to expand operations and look at going international. It was decided to cut out the middleman, Jack Chu, whose supply was deemed as too erratic and drawing unwanted attention from authorities, who by now were keeping tabs on the operation. So Marty had a plan, a big mission to undertake. His idea was to cut out the Singapore connection and go directly to the source and order the Buddha sticks from Thailand himself. But he would need a means of importing it. Luckily for Marty, his father owned a 45 steel-hulled ketch called the Brigadoon, and he also knew a skipper who could help. The idea was simple. Take the Brigadoon to Bangkok in Thailand, pick up the supply, and bring it back to New Zealand. The revenue gained from the big haul, estimated to be around 3 million New Zealand dollars, would ultimately fund the Syndicate's big Asian expansion. But the trip itself was almost cut short by a series of errors. The skipper and crew were inexperienced and ran the Brigadoon from reef to reef. The New Zealand police had the ketch under surveillance. The military police in Noumea caught the crew shoplifting, but ultimately let them go. When they finally made it to Chao Phraya River in Bangkok, the crew was taken by police escort to the fortified village where the marijuana crop was picked, dried, and compressed. Eventually, 40 bales were loaded aboard, and the Brigadoon set off again to return. But the crew ran afoul of more mishaps, in which saw the crew get malaria and stranded in Indonesia, but eventually made it back to New Zealand with the haul. With the success of the mission, Clark and Johnston decided to go even bigger and begin to entertain the idea of importing heroin and using their old friend, Chinese Jack Chu, who apparently had connections to opium warlords in the Golden Triangle. And this is how the Mr. Asia Syndicate was born. Terence John Clark was born in 1944 in Gisborne, New Zealand. Clark began his criminal career through petty crimes and became a police informant in the late 1960s. After being in prison at Waitakere Prison in the early 1970s, he married Norma Fleet, who was crippled by a strong addiction to heroin, who later died under mysterious circumstances. Clark was known for his womanizing and had a reputation for extreme violence. He was described by many accounts as being ruthless, conniving, and psychopathic. These traits would see Terry Clark rise to the top of the syndicate, and he wouldn't think twice to cross a friend to get there. You could even say that his violent and sadistic nature was well suited to the world of heroin trafficking. After his prison stint, he slowly gravitated to the new lucrative market of Buddha sticks, where he was introduced to Marty Johnston. In 1975, shortly after the Brigadoon episode mentioned previously, the syndicate wanted to expand its territory by importing high-grade Thai heroin. It was around this time he skipped bail on a heroin importing charge in New Zealand and fled the country to relocate in Australia. This placed him as the ideal candidate to head the Australian branch of the syndicate, while Marty and Jack Chu set up headquarters in Singapore, source the uncut heroin from Thailand, and ship it to Australia for Clark to distribute. From there, young female couriers would be employed to travel back to New Zealand using false-bottom suitcases or strap heroin to their bodies to get past customs officers. It should be noted that this was a time before drug squads or sniffer dogs were routinely used at New Zealand border security. Terry Clark, along with Greg Allard and Jim Diamond Shepherd, fronted the Operation Australia and worked loosely in a de facto setting with Sydney's biggest organised crime operation at the time, the Double Bay Mob. It was also around this time that Terry Clark began getting a taste for murder. During Mr. Asia's early days of operation in Australia, it was headed by Greg Allard and his de facto partner, Julie Thielman. Clark joined them later on in 1975, and they formed a network of distributors and dealers in Sydney's eastern suburbs amongst a growing community of New Zealand migrants. Employing a nice guy, bad guy routine amongst their dealers, to which Clark was only too happy to participate in the role as the heavy in the operation. When disputes and rip-offs began 2 years later, Clark used his skills as an enforcer to maintain discipline. Reportedly tired of the endless tensions and precautions required by the business, Allard decided to quit and cash in his share of the operation. After a fiery meeting with several of Mr. H's operatives in Melbourne 1977, Greg Allard and Julie Thielman seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. Police believe that Clark was responsible. Another of Clark's alleged victims was Harry Lewis, a middle-ranking courier with shares in one of Johnston's businesses. He was arrested at Sydney Airport in 1978 for cannabis importation, along with 2 female couriers. Lewis had absconded bail and fled north, and then he too disappeared. Although police thought Clark to be implicated in a number of executions, by far the most significant involved a young New Zealand couple, Douglas and Isabel Wilson. The couple had taken over Greg Allard's position shortly after his disappearance. They were arrested in Brisbane while they were awaiting a pickup of a drug shipment from a passing ship. After 3 days of interrogation, they spilled the beans on the whole operation, revealing details about Clark and Johnston, and believed that Clark was responsible for a number of murders. Most importantly, the Wilsons had alleged that the Syndicate had hired an inside man at the Australian Bureau of Narcotics for an annual retainer of $25,000 plus charges of $1,000 for computer information and $4,000 for the removal of a file. Amazingly, the police dismissed their claims. The Wilsons were then released and nothing was done about their allegations. Less than a year later, their bodies were found in Rye, Victoria. Later, a hitman, James Basley, was found guilty of the murders, having been ordered by Terry Clark. It should be noted that Basley was also suspected in the death of anti-drugs campaigner and politician Donald Mackay, thought to be ordered by the leaders of the Honoured Society, which we have briefly mentioned in a previous episode. Somewhere around this time, Diamond Jim Shepard began working for Clark and Johnston as their banker, shifting tens of millions of dollars in drug money. He moved money around the world through financial institutions, flew pricey lawyers overseas to set up dummy companies, transferred cash into assets like gold or shares, and even did direct swaps with wealthy businessmen. There was so much money going out of Australia by ship, air, and couriers that Jim Shepard had to lease a bank vault to store tightly packed suitcases full of $50 bills. Jim spoke openly about his relationship with Terry Clark and stated that, quote, "He was the sort of bloke you'd never turn your back on. A cold, calculating, and extremely dangerous man, but you never get that impression when you first met him." End quote. Terry Clark even boasted to Shepard about all the murders he had committed at a restaurant in Sydney, and it was these murders that ultimately led investigators in New Zealand and Australia hot on the tails of the Mr. Asia Syndicate. Terry Clark, a once sharp-minded drug dealer, was starting to unravel, and soon the dominoes of the operation would begin to topple. By May 1979, shortly after the bodies of Doug and Isabel Wilson were found, police in Australia and New Zealand were all well aware of the Syndicate. With too many bodies for corrupt cops to hush up, a media firestorm ensued, which revealed details about the confession from the Wilsons and the dismissal by police. This resulted in an inquiry into the Narcotics Bureau, and their commissioner Harvey Bates resigned in June of that year. Back in 1978, before the murders, Clark was arrested in a Queensland hotel at a party on heroin importing charges back in New Zealand in 1975 when he skipped bail and fled the country. He was extradited to New Zealand to face the charges, and this is where he meets lawyer Peter Williams and his young law clerk, Karen Soich. Clark was acquitted of these charges in October 1978, and it seems during his trial he'd begun a relationship with Karen Soich. It was around this time that reporter Pat Booth detailed the activities of the Syndicate and their associates and coined the name Mr. Asia. In mid-1979, Terry Clark and Karen Soich traveled to the United Kingdom, where the next phase of the operations were to begin. Meanwhile in Thailand, Marty Johnston had been struggling with a drug deal that ultimately failed. Marty had been traveling the world first class in the guise of a successful firm executive using false passports, as did Terry. But news of the failed deal reached Clark in England, and knowing his prior connections to murdered associates, Terry's plan was now to take out Johnston from the Mr. Asia Syndicate. In October of 1979, Terry Clark had Marty Johnston lured to England under the pretense of a drug deal in Scotland. Marty met with his old mate, Andy Marr, and his cousin, Jimmy Smith. Unbeknownst to Marty, Terry Clark had ordered the murder by the hands of his supposed friend, but his fear of Clark turned out to be stronger than that friendship. Johnston was shot twice in the head by Marr. The body was then taken to a garage, where Smith and Ma began disfiguring the body to remove any evidence of identity. This included the removal of Marty's hands. The body was then wrapped up, roped, and weighted. The pair then made their way to the Eccleston Delve, which was a quarry that had been flooded, and disposed of his body in its murky depths. Ironically, the ropes used to tie down Johnston's body had caught onto a diving guide rope, and his body sat on a ledge beneath the surface. Less than a month later, Johnston's body was found by two divers who alerted police. The police diver who recovered the body told sources that if Smith and Ma had been 1 meter further to the left when they dumped the body, it probably would have lain untouched for another 20 years. What followed was a murder investigation by police, who were able to confirm Johnston's identity by the medallion necklace he wore that Ma and Smith had failed to remove. Ironically, the Chinese symbol embossed on the medallion means long life. Their confessions led to police raiding Terry Clark's flat in Kensington in November of 1979. He was still in bed with his lawyer lover, Karen Soich. The British police had unknowingly unraveled the entire syndicate. Terry Clark, along with Andy Marr and Jimmy Smith, were convicted of murder, and Clark was sentenced to life imprisonment. His trial at the time was the most heavily guarded in British history. Terry died a few years later in 1983 at HM Prison Pankhurst on the Isle of Wight. Officially ruled as a heart attack, but other sources indicate he was murdered. The names associated to the Mr. Asia Syndicate remain legends in the seedy criminal underworld of New Zealand. A mass killer with a glamorous lawyer lover, a playboy drug baron, a harem of attractive young women couriers, hardened criminals, first-class flights all over the world, and making millions of dollars. But the impact that the syndicate had on the law and the innocent lives it ruined is far less glamorous. When Johnston and Clark began importing heroin into New Zealand, they ultimately brought upon a greater impact than just addiction. What is referred to as the silent epidemic, or hepatitis C, began taking its tolls on New Zealanders' lives with the likes of sharing needles. The extraordinary scale of the Mr. Asia Syndicate meant that it now left thousands of lives ruined in heroin addiction. But the echoes can still be felt, even today. Thanks for stopping by. This has been an exclusive Shadow Matter special episode on New Zealand's criminal underworld. If you would like to see more episodes on New Zealand's criminal underworld, or more stories anywhere all over the world, then please let me know in the comments below. Also, if you made it to the end, congratulations. If you would like to be featured like these comments here, then leave a comment starting with Shadow Shoutout. And as always, if you like this video, then hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to see more content like this, and don't forget to hit the notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the Shadow Matter.